The sun beat down mercilessly on Idaho City, Idaho, in the summer of 1874. As Hannah James stumbled toward the only water source in miles, her parched lips cracked and bleeding from 3 days of desperate travel across the unforgiving terrain. Her once fine blue calico dress was torn and dust-coated, her blonde hair falling in tangled waves from what had been a respectable bun when she'd fled her family home in Missouri, after her father's funeral revealed debts that would have forced her into marriage with a man 3 times her age. 5 men had been watching her approach for the past 10 minutes, their eyes narrowing as she reached the communal well at the edge of town. Hannah didn't notice them at first, too focused on the promise of cool water to slake her desperate thirst. Her trembling hands could barely manage to work the well's mechanism, her 20-year-old frame weakened from her journey. "Well, what do we have here?" The tallest of the men stepped forward, his tobacco-stained beard and weathered face twisting into what might have been meant as a smile but looked more like a predatory leer. "Ain't often we get such a pretty little thing wandering into town all by her lonesome." Hannah froze, suddenly aware of the circle of men closing in around her. The well's edge pressed against her back as she gripped the rope with white knuckles. "I mean no trouble, gentlemen. I'm just passing through. Passing through." Another man snorted, adjusting his gun belt meaningfully. "Looks to me like you're running from something, miss. Running women often carry trouble with them, or money," a third man added, eyeing what remained of her once fine dress. "Them's quality stitches on that dress." Hannah's heart hammered in her chest. These weren't the honorable working men of her hometown. These were the rough sort her father had warned her about, men who'd been too long without the civilizing influence of decent society. "I have no money," she said, striving to keep her voice steady. "Nothing of value, please. I just need water." The tallest one stepped closer. "Oh, I think you got something of value, all right." His hand reached toward her face. "She's done here." The deep voice cut through the tension like a knife. The circle of men parted slightly, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. He moved forward with the easy, confident gait of a man accustomed to commanding respect, spurs jingling softly with each step. Isaac Jensen was not what anyone would call a typical cowboy. His clothes were clean if trail-worn, his dark brown hair cut shorter than most, and though he wore a revolver on his hip, it seemed more functional than decorative. But there was something in his eyes, a steady, unflinching intensity that made the 5 men shift uncomfortably. "This ain't your business, Jensen," the tall man said, though he'd already taken a half-step back. "Making it my business, Harkins." Isaac moved deliberately to stand between Hannah and the men. "The lady needs water, not your company. I suggest you find something else to occupy your time." Hannah watched this exchange with equal parts fear and fascination. The newcomer hadn't drawn his weapon or even raised his voice, yet the men were treating him with obvious caution. "Come on, boys," Harkins finally muttered. "Ain't worth the trouble." With reluctant glances back at Hannah, the men dispersed, disappearing down different streets of the small mining town. Isaac turned to Hannah, his expression softening slightly. "You all right, miss?" Hannah nodded, still clutching the well rope. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Jensen, Isaac Jensen." He reached for the bucket she'd been struggling with and easily drew water from the depths of the well. "You look like you've traveled hard. Here." He offered her a tin cup from his saddlebag, filling it with cool water. Hannah accepted it gratefully, trying to remember her manners even as she drank deeply. "Hannah James," she said between sips, "I'm indebted to your kindness, Mr. Jensen." Isaac watched her with careful assessment. "Miss James, if you don't mind my saying, Idaho City isn't the sort of place a young woman should be wandering alone. Those men won't stay gone long." "I didn't intend to stop here," Hannah admitted. I'm headed to Oregon to my mother's sister. I just needed water. Isaac nodded thoughtfully. Oregon's still a long way. You got supplies. A horse. Hannah's silence and downcast eyes answered for her. The little money she'd had was gone, spent on a stagecoach ride that had only taken her halfway to her destination before she'd been forced to continue on foot. I see. Isaac refilled her cup. Miss James, I'm heading north myself, driving cattle to Boise first, then on to Oregon after that. I've got a good crew, decent men. You'd be welcome to travel with us, at least as far as your destination. Hannah looked up, startled by the offer. I couldn't possibly. You can and you should, Isaac said firmly. These parts aren't safe for lone travelers, especially women. My men and I leave at dawn tomorrow. Think it over. He gestured toward a respectable-looking building down the street. Mrs. Thornton runs a boarding house there. Tell her Isaac sent you. She'll give you a fair price for a room tonight. Before Hannah could respond, Isaac tipped his hat and turned to leave. Dawn, Miss James, by the livery stable. Hannah watched him go, this strange cowboy who'd appeared from nowhere to help her, then disappeared just as quickly. She had little choice, she knew. Her situation was desperate, her options few. And something about Isaac Jensen, despite his abrupt manner, gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt since leaving home. With a deep breath, she smoothed her tattered dress as best she could and headed toward the boarding house. Whatever lay ahead, at least she'd face it after a night's sleep and with the prospect of safe passage toward her destination. The boarding house was modest but clean, and Mrs. Thornton, a stout woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, did indeed offer Hannah a reasonable rate upon hearing Isaac's name. More surprising was the bath she insisted upon, and the simple but sturdy dress she provided from a trunk of abandoned belongings. Can't have you traveling with Jensen's outfit looking like you've been dragged through the desert, Mrs. Thornton said matter-of-factly as she helped Hannah comb the tangles from her hair. Though I'm surprised he offered, not usually one to take on strays, that man. You know him well. Hannah ventured, curious about her unexpected benefactor. Mrs. Thornton's hands stilled momentarily. Well enough. He's passed through Idaho City regular like for 5 years now, driving cattle north. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's fair in his dealings and never brings trouble to my doorstep. That's more than I can say for most men in these parts. Hannah sensed there was more, but Mrs. Thornton changed the subject, asking about Hannah's journey thus far. Hannah shared a carefully edited version of her story: her father's death, the unexpected debts, her need to reach her aunt in Oregon. She omitted the unwanted suitor who tried to claim her hand in exchange for settling her father's obligations, a man whose persistent advances had ultimately driven her to flee in the night. That evening, lying on a real bed for the first time in days, Hannah considered her options. Traveling alone was clearly dangerous, but joining a group of strange men carried its own risks. Yet something in Isaac Jensen's direct gaze had inspired trust, and Mrs. Thornton's obvious respect for him suggested her instincts weren't misplaced. Before dawn, Hannah was dressed in her new clothing, a practical brown skirt, white blouse, and sturdy boots that Mrs. Thornton insisted were better suited for travel than her ruined city shoes. With her few possessions bundled in a borrowed cloth sack and her hair braided neatly down her back, she thanked the older woman and headed for the livery stable. Isaac was already there, conferring with 4 other men as they readied horses and checked supply wagons. He looked up as she approached, giving her a brief nod of acknowledgement. Miss James, glad you decided to join us. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Jensen, Hannah replied formally, conscious of the curious glances from the other men. Isaac seemed to notice their interest too. Men, This is Miss Hannah James. She'll be traveling with us as far as Oregon. Miss James, this is my crew: William Donovan, Samuel Cox, Marcus Reid, and Ellie Thompson. The men touched their hats respectfully, though Hannah couldn't miss the questioning looks they exchanged. Clearly, a woman joining their party was unusual. Miss James will ride in the supply wagon with Ellie, Isaac continued. We've got 300 head of cattle to move, so we'll be taking it slow and steady. Any questions, you come to me or Ellie. He may look young, but he's got a good head on his shoulders. Ellie, a freckle-faced young man who couldn't be more than 22, blushed at the compliment and gestured toward the second wagon. Made up a spot for you, madam. It ain't fancy, but it's comfortable enough. Hannah thanked him, touched by the effort. The wagon had indeed been arranged to provide her a small space among the supplies, with blankets forming a makeshift seat. As the group prepared to depart, Hannah noticed how efficiently they worked together, each man knowing his task without need for instruction. Isaac moved among them, checking preparations with a critical eye but offering few words. When he swung into his saddle atop a magnificent chestnut gelding, the others followed suit without hesitation. Miss James, Isaac called, bringing his horse alongside her wagon. The journey won't be easy. We'll be crossing rough country, moving slow with the herd. But you'll be safe with us. You have my word on that. Hannah nodded, recognizing the significance of such a promise in this wild territory where a person's word was often the only law that mattered. I'm grateful, Mr. Jensen, and I won't be a burden. I can cook and mend, and I'm stronger than I look. The corners of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but close. I don't doubt it, Miss James. A woman who made it this far alone has grit. With that, he turned his horse and signaled the start of their journey. As they left Idaho City behind, the cattle strung out before them in a moving river of brown and white. Hannah realized she'd taken yet another leap of faith in her desperate journey west. But watching Isaac Jensen's straight-backed figure leading the way, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. The first 3 days of travel established a rhythm to their journey. The men rose before dawn, prepared a quick breakfast, and then moved the cattle through the rugged Idaho landscape. They stopped briefly at midday when the summer heat was at its worst, then continued until dusk when they made camp for the night. Hannah quickly found ways to make herself useful. Though the men had initially been awkward around her, her willingness to work and lack of complaints soon earned their respect. She took over the cooking duties from a grateful Ellie, turning their basic provisions into meals that had even the taciturn William expressing appreciation. She mended tears in clothing, dressed minor injuries, and never once asked to slow their pace. Isaac maintained a polite distance, speaking to her only when necessary about practical matters. Yet Hannah often felt his eyes on her, watching with an intensity that made her simultaneously nervous and curious. He was a puzzle, respectful yet reserved, clearly capable of violence as he demonstrated at the well, yet gentle with both animals and his men. On the fourth evening, as Hannah stirred a pot of beans over the campfire, Samuel returned from hunting with 2 rabbits. Thought these might make a nice change from trail rations, Miss Hannah, he said, offering her his catch with a shy smile. That's thoughtful of you, Samuel. Thank you. Hannah accepted the rabbits, noting how the older man had gradually warmed to her presence. At 45, Samuel was the eldest of the group and had initially been the most skeptical of having a woman along. As she prepared the rabbits, she glanced up to find Isaac watching her from where he sat cleaning his revolver. Their eyes met briefly before he looked away, but not before Hannah caught a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. Later, as they ate around the fire, Marcus broke the comfortable silence. Miss Hannah, might I ask what takes you to Oregon? You got family there, Hannah nodded, setting aside her plate. "My aunt, my mother's sister. She's all the family I have left now." "Your parents passed on?" Ellie asked gently. "My mother when I was 14. My father just 3 months ago." Hannah stared into the flames, trying to keep the emotion from her voice. "He was a merchant in Springfield, Missouri. I thought we were comfortably situated, but after his death, I discovered he'd accumulated significant debts." She hesitated, aware that Isaac was listening intently though he hadn't looked up from his food. "There was a man willing to settle those debts in exchange for my hand in marriage. He was not someone I could accept, so I decided to seek out my aunt instead." "You ran," Isaac said quietly, the first personal comment he'd directed to her since their journey began. Hannah lifted her chin. "Yes, Mr. Jensen, I ran." "Would you have preferred I sold myself to a man I could never respect, much less love?" The camp fell silent, the men looking uncomfortably between them. Isaac's dark eyes held hers for a long moment before he set his plate down. "No," he said finally. "I wouldn't expect that of anyone." He stood, effectively ending the conversation. "We should all turn in. Dawn comes early." As the men dispersed to their bedrolls, Hannah remained by the fire, troubled by the exchange. Had she offended him somehow? His reaction seemed out of proportion to her words. She was still pondering this when Ali approached, collecting plates to wash in the nearby stream. "Don't mind Isaac," he said quietly. "He's not much for talking about the past, his or anyone else's." "Does he have family somewhere?" Hannah asked, curious despite herself. Ali shook his head. "Not that he's ever mentioned. Been working with him 3 years now, and all I know is he fought for the Union in the war, came west after, and knows cattle better than most men born to it." He glanced toward where Isaac had disappeared into the darkness. "Whatever his story is, he keeps it close." Hannah nodded, understanding all too well the desire to leave painful histories behind. Still, as she prepared for sleep in her small tent, another courtesy Isaac had insisted upon for her privacy, she couldn't help wondering what had shaped the man who'd come to her rescue, and yet seemed determined to keep her at arm's length. The next day brought challenges as they navigated a steep mountain pass. The cattle were reluctant to climb the narrow trail, and twice they nearly lost animals to panic as they crossed a shallow but swift-flowing river. Hannah watched from the wagon as Isaac and his men worked tirelessly, their coordination and skill evident in how they handled the difficult terrain and nervous animals. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered ominously on the horizon. The air grew heavy with impending rain, and Isaac called a halt earlier than usual, directing them to a sheltered area beneath a stand of pines. "Storm's coming," he announced as the men hurried to secure the camp. "Miss James, you'll want to make sure your tent is well anchored tonight." Hannah had just begun to unpack cooking supplies when the first fat raindrops fell. Within minutes, the skies opened in a deluge that sent everyone scrambling for cover. She abandoned the meal preparations and dashed for her tent, arriving soaked to the skin despite the short distance. Inside, she changed quickly into her spare clothes, grateful she'd thought to protect them with oilcloth. The tent, though small, was sturdy, but water soon began seeping beneath the edges as the ground saturated. Hannah used one of her blankets to soak up the worst of it, resigning herself to a damp and uncomfortable night. A shadow appeared outside her tent. "Miss James," Isaac's voice carried over the drumming rain. "May I check your shelter?" "Yes, of course," she called back, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Isaac ducked inside, bringing a gust of wet air with him. His hat and coat were sodden, water dripping from his beard onto his already soaked shirt. He surveyed the tent quickly, frowning at the water pooling along one side. "This won't do," he said decisively. "The ground's too saturated here. We need to move you." "Move where?" Hannah asked, looking dubiously at the torrential rain outside. "Everything must be flooded by now." "The supply wagon has a canvas cover. We can secure it better than this tent." He gestured for her to gather her things. "Hurry, it's only going to get worse." Hannah didn't argue. She quickly bundled her belongings, and when Isaac offered his coat to shield her from the rain, she accepted gratefully. Together they dashed through the downpour to the wagon, where Illy was already working to reinforce the canvas covering. "Get her settled, Illy," Isaac directed. "I'll check on the others." Before Hannah could thank him, he was gone, disappearing into the storm to ensure his men and animals were safe. Illy helped her into the wagon, where he'd arranged crates to create a dry platform above the damp floorboards. "It's not much, Miss Hannah, but it's the best we can do tonight." "It's perfect, Illy. Thank you." She settled onto the makeshift bed, touched by his thoughtfulness. The storm raged throughout the night, wind howling through the trees and rain pounding against the canvas. Hannah lay awake, listening to the tempest and wondering if Isaac was somewhere out in it, still checking on his responsibilities while the rest of them sheltered. Near dawn, the storm finally abated. Hannah emerged from the wagon to find a transformed landscape, streams where there had been dry ground, trees stripped of weaker branches, and mud everywhere. The cattle had weathered the night well enough, though they were clustered tightly together, skittish from the storm. The men looked exhausted, especially Isaac, whose bloodshot eyes suggested he'd had little if any sleep. Still, they set about breaking camp with their usual efficiency, eager to make up for lost time. As Hannah gathered what remained of their supplies to prepare breakfast, Isaac approached her, his expression grave. "The storm washed out part of the trail ahead. We'll need to find another route, which means a delay of at least 2 days." "I understand," Hannah assured him. "These things can't be helped." He studied her face as if searching for signs of complaint or distress. Finding none, he nodded slightly. "We'll head northwest, follow the ridge line until we can cut back to our original route. The terrain will be rougher." "I'm not afraid of rough terrain, Mr. Jensen." Hannah returned his gaze steadily. "I've faced worse challenges than mud and mountains." Something flickered in his eyes, respect perhaps, or surprise at her resilience. "Yes," he said after a moment, "I believe you have." That brief exchange marked a subtle shift in their interaction. Over the next several days, as they navigated the difficult detour, Isaac began to include Hannah in discussions about their route and timing. He no longer avoided direct conversation with her, and occasionally, she even caught him watching her with something other than his usual guarded assessment, a softening around his eyes that vanished the moment he realized she'd noticed. The altered route took them through a narrow valley where the grazing was good but water scarce. On their 3rd day there, Isaac announced that he and Hannah would ride ahead to scout for a suitable water source while the others remained with the herd. "Me?" Hannah asked, surprised by the suggestion. "Wouldn't William or Samuel be more helpful?" "They know cattle better than terrain," Isaac replied, adjusting the saddle on a gentle mare he'd chosen for her. "And you've got a good eye for detail. I've noticed how you spot things others miss." The compliment, unexpected and matter-of-fact, warmed her more than it should have. "Very well, Mr. Jensen. I'm happy to help." They set out just after sunrise, riding side by side across the valley floor. Hannah had grown comfortable on horseback during their journey, but this was the first time she'd ridden with only Isaac for company. Initially, they traveled in companionable silence, but as the hours passed, Hannah found herself wanting to breach the careful distance he maintained. "Mr. Jensen," she ventured as they paused to rest the horses in the shade of a lone cottonwood, May I ask how you came to this line of work? Driving cattle through such difficult country seems an unusual choice. Isaac took a long drink from his canteen before answering. After the war, I needed something that would keep me moving. Staying in one place didn't suit me anymore. Hannah waited, hoping he might elaborate, but he seemed to consider the question answered. Undeterred, she tried again. You fought for the Union, Ellie mentioned. Isaac's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, Indiana 27th Infantry. My father supported the Union cause, though he was too old to fight, Hannah offered. He lost his brother at Shiloh. Isaac nodded, his eyes distant. Lot of good men died at Shiloh. After a moment, he added quietly, I was there. Hannah sensed the weight of memories in those simple words. I'm sorry, it must have been terrible, war always is. Isaac's voice was flat, but when he looked at her, something in his expression had shifted. Your father, he was a good man. The best, Hannah said without hesitation. Kind, honest to a fault. He never fully recovered after my mother died, but he made sure I was educated and cared for. You loved him very much. I did. She smiled sadly. Which makes it harder to reconcile the man I knew with the financial disaster he left behind. I still don't understand how it happened. Isaac was quiet for a moment. Sometimes good men make poor decisions for what they believe are the right reasons. Doesn't make them less good, just human. The insight surprised her, not just the words themselves, but the compassion behind them. That's a generous way to look at it. It's the truth, Isaac said simply. He stood, signaling an end to their rest. We should keep moving. Need to find water before sundown. As they continued their scouting mission, Hannah felt the conversation had cracked, ever so slightly, the careful wall Isaac maintained. He began asking her questions about her life in Missouri, her education, her interests, the books she enjoyed. In turn, she learned small details about him. He'd been raised on a farm in southern Indiana, had taught himself to play harmonica during the war, and preferred winter to summer despite the hardships of cold weather travel. By late afternoon, they'd found what they were looking for, a clear, spring-fed stream running along the western edge of the valley, with good access for the cattle and ample grazing nearby. As they prepared to return to the herd, dark clouds began building on the horizon once again. We won't make it back before that hits, Isaac observed, studying the sky with a frown. Better find shelter and wait it out. They rode along the stream until they discovered a shallow cave in the rocky hillside, just large enough to provide shelter for themselves and their horses. They'd barely secured the animals and ducked inside when the storm broke, not with rain this time but with hail that clattered against the rocks and bounced across the ground outside. That would have hurt, Hannah commented, watching marble-sized hailstones accumulate. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and she rubbed her arms against the sudden chill. Isaac noticed her discomfort and shrugged out of his coat, draping it around her shoulders despite her protests. I'm used to the cold, he insisted. Part of the job. The coat was warm from his body and carried his scent: leather, wood smoke, and something distinctly masculine. Hannah tried not to think about how intimate it felt to be wrapped in his garment as they sat side by side, watching the storm rage outside their small shelter. Your aunt in Oregon, Isaac said after a comfortable silence. Is she expecting you? Hannah hesitated. I wrote to her before leaving Missouri, but I have no way of knowing if the letter arrived ahead of me. We haven't corresponded regularly for years, not since my mother died. And if she's not there, or can't take you in, it was a possibility Hannah had forced herself not to consider too deeply. Then I'll find work. I'm educated enough to teach if a school would have me, or I could work as a seamstress or housekeeper. I'm not afraid of starting over. Isaac studied her with that intense gaze that seemed to see more than she intended to reveal. No, you wouldn't be. Not a woman who fled across half the country rather than compromise her principles. There was unmistakable admiration in his voice, and Hannah felt a flush of pleasure at his assessment. Some might call it foolish rather than principled, choosing an uncertain future over security. Security bought at the cost of your spirit isn't security at all, Isaac said with unexpected passion. It's a gilded cage. Better to face the wilderness on your own terms than live someone else's life in comfort. Hannah was struck by the fervor in his words, so different from his usual measured tone. You sound as if you speak from experience, Mr. Jensen. He looked away, his jaw tightening. Let's just say I understand the value of choosing your own path, however difficult. The hail stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving a transformed landscape glittering with ice in the late afternoon sun. They would need to ride hard to reach the others before nightfall, Isaac explained as they prepared to leave their shelter. As Hannah returned his coat, their hands touched briefly. The contact, fleeting though it was, sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the garment's heat. From Isaac's momentarily startled expression, she wondered if he'd felt it too, this strange, growing connection between them. The ride back was swift and largely silent, both of them absorbed in their thoughts. When they rejoined the camp, the men were visibly relieved to see them safe, having worried when the hailstorm hit. That night, as Hannah prepared dinner, she caught herself watching Isaac more than usual, the confident way he moved, the quiet authority he commanded without raising his voice, the rare smile that transformed his serious features when one of the men made a joke. More than once, she looked up to find him watching her in return, his dark eyes thoughtful in the firelight. Something had changed between them during their day alone, something neither acknowledged but both felt. Hannah told herself it was merely friendship developing, a natural result of shared experiences. Yet when their eyes met across the campfire, the flutter in her chest suggested it might be something more complicated and potentially dangerous than simple friendship. The next morning, as they prepared to move the herd to the water source, Hannah and Isaac had discovered an unexpected visitor arrived at their camp. A lone rider approached from the east, his horse moving at a steady pace that suggested neither threat nor urgency. Isaac stepped forward to meet the stranger, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. The men positioned themselves strategically around the camp, a precaution Hannah had noticed they always took when encountering unknown travelers. The rider proved to be a U.S. Marshal named James Hollister, a weathered man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and the watchful eyes of someone who'd seen the worst humanity had to offer. He dismounted, greeting Isaac with the familiarity of previous acquaintance. "Jensen. Didn't expect to find you in these parts this time of year." Isaac shook the man's hand. "Storm washed out our usual route, had to detour." His posture remained relaxed, but Hannah noticed a new alertness in his manner. "What brings a marshal this far from the usual trails?" Hollister accepted the coffee William offered him, nodding his thanks. "Tracking a gang that hit the bank in Salmon City last week. 3 men, led by a fellow named Curtis Blackwood. You haven't crossed paths with any suspicious characters, have you?" Hannah saw Isaac's shoulders tense at the name, though his expression remained neutral. "Can't say that we have. Been keeping to ourselves, focusing on moving the herd." The marshal's gaze traveled around the camp, pausing briefly on Hannah with mild surprise before continuing his assessment. "They killed 2 people during the robbery, the bank manager and a young clerk who tried to stop them. Governors put a substantial bounty on Blackwood's head." "Sorry to hear about the deaths," Isaac said evenly. "But we haven't seen anyone in days, except for Miss James here, who's traveling with us to Oregon. Hollister nodded politely in Hannah's direction. Madam, unusual to see a lady with a cattle drive. Unusual circumstances, Marshal, Hannah replied with a small smile. Mr. Jensen was kind enough to offer safe passage when I found myself stranded in Idaho City. Jensen's always had a soft spot for those in need, Hollister remarked, with a meaningful look that Hannah couldn't quite interpret. It served him well in recent years. The comment seemed loaded with subtext that escaped her, but she noticed how Isaac's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. If you're tracking Blackwood, you'll want to head northwest, Isaac said, clearly changing the subject. The pass we usually take is washed out, but a man on horseback could make it through. If he's running, that's the quickest route to the territories where laws spread thin. Hollister considered this information. Appreciate the tip. Mind if I rest my horse a bit before moving on? Been in the saddle since dawn yesterday. Stay for breakfast, Isaac offered. Miss James is a fine cook, and we've plenty to spare. The marshal accepted gratefully, and for the next hour he shared news from the more settled regions they'd left behind. Hannah noticed how carefully the men avoided discussing their own business or future plans in his presence, not suspiciously so, but with the natural caution of those who preferred to keep their affairs private. When Hollister finally departed, headed in the direction Isaac had suggested, an odd tension lingered in the camp. Hannah observed Isaac watching the marshal until he disappeared from sight, his expression unreadable. "Problem, boss?" Samuel asked quietly, coming to stand beside him. Isaac shook his head. "No, just wondering what Hollister didn't say." He turned to the men. "Let's move out. Want to reach that stream by midday." As they resumed their journey, Hannah found herself riding near the front wagon where Lee handled the reins. Curiosity finally got the better of her. "Illy, do you know why Mr. Jensen seemed concerned about the marshal's visit? They appeared to know each other." Illy glanced around to ensure Isaac was out of earshot. "Marshal Hollister arrested Isaac about 5 years back," he said in a low voice. "Don't know the details happened before I joined up, but Samuel says it was a case of mistaken identity. Isaac spent 3 months in jail before they sorted it out." 3 months, Hannah exclaimed, then lowered her voice. "For something he didn't do," Lee shrugged. "Justice moves slow out here." Samuel says Hollister always felt bad about it, especially after the real culprit was caught. That's probably why he mentioned Isaac's soft spot for those in need. It's his way of acknowledging that Isaac knows what it's like to be wrongfully accused. Hannah mulled this over, watching Isaac's straight-backed figure as he rode ahead of the herd. 3 months imprisoned for another man's crime would embitter many. Yet Isaac had shown her nothing but fairness and consideration. It spoke volumes about his character. The day progressed smoothly, the cattle moving well now that the ground had dried from the recent storms. By sunset, they had established a new camp beside the stream, with good grazing for the animals and fresh water for everyone. After dinner, as the men settled in with their evening coffee, Hannah approached Isaac where he sat slightly apart from the others, making notes in a small leather-bound journal. "May I join you?" she asked hesitantly. He looked up, surprise flickering across his features before he nodded, closing the journal. "Of course." Hannah sat beside him on the fallen log he'd chosen as a seat. "I wanted to thank you again, not just for the rescue in Idaho City, but for everything since. Your kindness has meant more than I can express." Isaac seemed uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You've more than earned your keep, Miss James. The men haven't eaten this well in years." "Hannah," she said suddenly, "please, after all this time traveling together, I wish you'd call me Hannah." He studied her for a long moment. "Hannah," he repeated, her name sounding different somehow in his deep voice. "Then I suppose you should call me Isaac. She smiled, pleased at this small victory. "Isaac, it suits you." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the campfire and the soft conversations of the men nearby. Hannah gazed up at the star-filled sky, marveling at its vastness. "I never saw stars like this in Missouri," she murmured. "The town lights always dimmed them." "One of the benefits of the trail," Isaac agreed, following her gaze upward. "No matter how difficult the day, the night sky makes it worthwhile." "Is that why you choose this life?" Hannah asked. "The freedom of it." Isaac considered her question seriously. "Partly. After the war, I couldn't settle. Too many memories, too many ghosts. Out here, with just the sky and the land and honest work, it's simpler. Yet not simple enough to avoid marshals looking for bank robbers," Hannah observed with gentle humor. Isaac's expression closed slightly. "Hollister's a good lawman, thorough, but Blackwood's dangerous, not someone you want to cross paths with. You know him, this Blackwood." Isaac was quiet for so long that Hannah thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "We served in the same regiment during the war, different companies." He was troubled even then. The war changed many men, but some it just gave permission to be the monsters they already were inside. The personal nature of this revelation wasn't lost on Hannah. It was the most Isaac had ever shared about his past. "That's why you tensed when the marshal mentioned his name." Isaac looked at her with renewed intensity. "You notice a lot." "I've had to learn to read people quickly," Hannah admitted. "After my father died and I discovered the extent of his debts, many who'd claimed to be friends suddenly became strangers or worse, predators. Like the man who offered to settle the debts in exchange for marriage," Isaac deduced. Hannah nodded, a shadow crossing her face. "Henry Lawson. He was my father's business partner, 3 decades my senior and twice widowed. He presented his proposal as generosity, but his eyes—" She shuddered slightly at the memory. "There was nothing generous in how he looked at me." Isaac's hand moved as if he might reach for hers, but he stopped himself. "You were right to leave. I know. But sometimes I wonder if I should have found another way, one that wouldn't have meant abandoning my father's reputation to rumors and gossip." She sighed, suddenly feeling the weight of her decisions. "Running seems to be my solution to everything." "There's a difference between running from something and running toward something better," Isaac said firmly. "Don't confuse the two." His conviction struck a chord in Hannah. "Is that what you're doing? Running toward something better?" Isaac's gaze returned to the stars. "I'm still figuring that out. Been on the move so long, sometimes I forget what I'm looking for." The honesty of his answer touched Hannah deeply. This man, so careful with his words and emotions, had just offered her a glimpse of his true self, the uncertainty behind the confident exterior, the searching behind the purposeful journey. "Perhaps," she suggested softly, "what we're looking for finds us when we least expect it." Their eyes met in the dim light, and for a breathless moment, Hannah felt something powerful pass between them, a recognition of kindred spirits, of shared loneliness, of unexpected connection. The moment broke when William called out to Isaac about the next day's route. Isaac stood, his expression once again composed, though his eyes lingered on Hannah's face a second longer than necessary. "Rest well, Hannah," he said quietly. "Tomorrow will be a long day." As she watched him walk away to join the men, Hannah acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding for days. She was falling in love with Isaac Jensen, a man as unpredictable as the wilderness around them, whose past remained largely a mystery, and whose future seemed permanently in motion. A man who, in less than 2 weeks, would deliver her to her aunt in Oregon and continue on his own path without looking back. It was, she realized with a mixture of amusement and despair, exactly the sort of complication she'd been trying to avoid in her carefully planned escape from Missouri. The next week brought clearer weather and good progress as they moved steadily northward. The terrain gradually changed from steep mountain passes to rolling hills covered in tall grass perfect for the cattle, who grew noticeably less restless with the abundant grazing. Hannah found herself increasingly aware of Isaac's presence, the sound of his voice as he called instructions to the men. The sight of him silhouetted against the sunrise as he scouted ahead each morning, the brush of his hand against hers when he helped her down from the wagon each evening. Small moments that left her heart beating faster and her thoughts in disarray. For his part, Isaac seemed to be struggling with his own confusion. Sometimes he sought her company, engaging her in conversation about books they'd both read or sharing stories of places he'd seen in his travels. Other times he maintained a deliberate distance, speaking to her only when necessary and riding far ahead or behind to avoid prolonged interaction. The men noticed this curious dance between them. Hannah caught their knowing glances and whispered comments that ceased whenever she or Isaac approached. Only Ellie spoke openly, catching her alone one afternoon as she gathered wild onions to add to the evening stew. "Never seen the boss so tied up in knots," he remarked casually, kneeling to help her harvest the pungent bulbs. "Not even when we lost 30 head in that flash flood last spring." Hannah focused intently on the plants before her. "I'm not sure what you mean," Ellie chuckled. "Course you don't. And I'm sure it's just coincidence that he keeps finding reasons to ride near your wagon, or that he perks up like a schoolboy whenever you start talking." "Ellie Thompson, you're imagining things," Hannah protested, though she couldn't quite suppress a smile. "Am I? Then I must be imagining how you watch him when you think nobody's looking too." His freckled face grew serious. "The boss is a good man, Miss Hannah, best I've ever worked for, but he's been carrying something heavy for a long time. Something that keeps him from staying anywhere or with anyone for long." Hannah's hand stilled. "Has he ever spoken of it?" "Not directly. But Samuel's known him longest, and he says Isaac had someone once back before the war. Never talks about her, but he visits a certain grave in Illinois every year on his way back from delivering cattle. Always alone." The revelation settled like a stone in Hannah's chest. A lost love, perhaps a wife or fiancée, would explain so much about Isaac's reluctance to form attachments, his preference for a life of constant movement. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "It helps to understand." Ellie nodded, seemingly relieved she wasn't offended by his forthrightness. "Just thought you should know. Whatever's between you two, and don't tell me there's nothing, it might not be as simple as either of you wishes it were." That evening, Hannah found herself watching Isaac with new eyes, wondering about the woman he had loved and lost. Was it her memory that made him hesitate whenever their conversations ventured beyond the superficial? Was it grief that put that shadow in his eyes when he thought no one was looking? The opportunity to ask came unexpectedly the following day. A lame horse necessitated a brief stop while William, their most experienced horseman, examined the animal. Isaac used the delay to check their maps, spreading them on a flat rock some distance from the wagons. Hannah, gathering water from a nearby spring, noticed him frowning over the parchment. "Problem?" she asked, approaching with a filled canteen. Isaac looked up, momentarily startled from his concentration. "Just trying to decide which route to take after boys. The southern trail is more direct, but the northern has better water access." Hannah studied the map, noting the rivers and settlements marked in faded ink. "How far are we from my aunt's homestead now?" Isaac pointed to a spot near the Oregon border. "About 2 weeks if all goes well. Her place should be here near Baker City." The reminder of their imminent parting hung between them like an unspoken question. Hannah took a deep breath, deciding to address the larger issue that had been growing more obvious with each passing day. Isaac, I feel I should acknowledge what's happening between us. His body tensed visibly. Hannah, please let me finish, she interrupted gently. I'm not naive. I know that feelings developed on the trail in these unusual circumstances may not translate to real life. I understand you have your reasons for the life you've chosen, and I would never presume to ask you to change that for someone you've known barely 2 weeks. Isaac's expression was unreadable as she continued. But I would regret not telling you that these have been the most meaningful 2 weeks of my life, not despite the hardships, but because of how we've faced them together. You've shown me a kind of strength and integrity I didn't know existed in men, and She faltered briefly before finding her courage again. I've come to care for you, more than I should, perhaps. Isaac stood motionless, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her heart race. For a moment, she thought he might not respond at all. Then he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his brown eyes. Hannah, he said, his voice rougher than usual. What I feel for you, it's not simple. Nothing in my life has prepared me for it. He ran a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of frustration. I've spent years keeping people at arm's length. It's safer that way for them and for me. Because of what happened during the war, Hannah ventured. Or because of her, the woman you lost. Isaac's expression sharpened with surprise. Who told you about Elizabeth? No one told me directly, Hannah hastened to explain. Illy mentioned you visit a grave each year, I assumed. Elizabeth was my sister, Isaac said quietly. Not my wife or sweetheart as you seem to think. She died while I was fighting at Vicksburg pneumonia, they said, though I've always wondered if it was really grief that killed her. Hannah's confusion must have shown on her face because Isaac continued, his voice low and intense. Her husband, my best friend since childhood, was killed at Antietam. When I couldn't get leave to attend his funeral, Elizabeth wrote that she understood, that she'd be strong. 6 months later, she was gone too. His jaw clenched with old pain. I wasn't there for either of them when they needed me most. You were serving your country, Hannah said softly. That's not something to feel guilty about, isn't it? I enlisted with such certainty, such righteousness. David followed me, he always did. If I'd stayed home, worked the farm as our father wanted. He shook his head. Instead, I came home to 2 graves and parents who could barely look at me. The pieces of Isaac's character suddenly aligned in Hannah's, understanding his reluctance to form attachments, his fierce protection of those in his care, his preference for a life that kept him constantly moving rather than dwelling on the past. So you punish yourself by denying yourself any chance at happiness, she concluded. You keep moving so you never have to face losing someone again. Isaac's eyes flickered with surprise at her insight. It's not that simple, isn't it? Isaac, grief and guilt can become comfortable companions if we let them. They're reliable, they never leave, never change. But they're poor substitutes for living. He stared at her, something vulnerable crossing his face. And what would you know about it? I watched my father die by inches after my mother passed, Hannah said, her own voice tight with emotion. He existed, but he stopped living. Everything that brought him joy became just a reminder of what he'd lost. I promised myself I would never let grief define me that way. Yet you ran from your home, your life, Isaac pointed out. I ran from a situation that would have killed my spirit, Hannah corrected him. Not from the possibility of being hurt. There's a difference. Their eyes held in a moment of perfect understanding. Then, slowly, Isaac reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, his calloused fingers incredibly gentle against her cheek. "Hannah James," he said softly, "you are the most unexpected thing that's ever happened to me." Before she could respond, William called out from the wagons. The horse was ready, and they needed to move on before losing more daylight. The moment shattered, leaving Hannah breathless with what had been said and what remained unspoken between them. Isaac stepped back, his hand falling to his side. "We should get back." Hannah nodded, her heart too full for words. As they walked together toward the waiting wagons, she felt the subtle shift in their relationship, a new honesty, a shared vulnerability that had changed everything, regardless of what the future might hold. The next several days brought new challenges as they approached more populated territories. Twice, they encountered other travelers, a family in a covered wagon heading west, and a group of miners returning east after an unsuccessful season. Each time, Isaac ensured Hannah was kept somewhat separate from these strangers, his protective instincts clearly on alert after Marshal Hollister's warnings about Blackwood and his gang. Hannah understood his caution and didn't resist, though she enjoyed the brief conversations with the family, especially their young daughters who were delighted to see another woman after weeks on the trail. The girl's mother confided that they were heading to Oregon to join her brother, who had established a successful lumber business near Portland. "It's hard leaving everything behind," the woman said as she and Hannah shared a quick cup of tea while the men exchanged information about trail conditions ahead. "But Thomas says the opportunities out west are worth the sacrifice." "That's what my aunt writes as well," Hannah replied, though in truth, her aunt's letters had been infrequent and vague over the years. "A chance to build something new." The woman glanced toward where Isaac stood talking with her husband. "You're fortunate to have such capable protection for your journey. Your husband seems very experienced in these territories." Hannah felt her cheeks warm. "Oh, Mr. Jensen isn't my husband. He and his men were kind enough to offer me safe passage when I found myself stranded." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly, but she was too polite to comment further on what must have seemed an unusual arrangement. "Well, God sends help in unexpected ways sometimes. We'll pray for your safe arrival." As the family continued their journey westward, Hannah caught Isaac watching her with a thoughtful expression. "What did Mrs. Miller have to say?" he asked as they returned to their own wagons. "She was telling me about their plans in Oregon," Hannah replied, "and she assumed you were my husband." Isaac's step faltered almost imperceptibly. "Ah, did you correct her misunderstanding?" "Of course. Though I'm not sure she approved of my traveling with 5 unmarried men, however honorable your intentions." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "People tend to see what they expect to see. A woman traveling with men in these parts, they assume there must be a proper reason." "And is there?" Hannah asked, suddenly bold. "A proper reason?" Isaac's eyes met hers, serious again. "You needed safe passage. We could provide it. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the true one." "And sometimes," Hannah replied quietly, "the truth is more complicated than we're willing to admit." Before Isaac could respond, Eli approached with news that one of the cattle had wandered off, effectively ending their private conversation. But throughout the day, Hannah caught Isaac watching her with an expression that suggested their exchange had left him as unsettled as it had her. That night, as they made camp near a small tributary of the Snake River, the warm summer air carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. After dinner, while the men played cards by firelight, Hannah walked to the riverbank to wash dishes and enjoy a moment of solitude. The water flowed clear and cool over smooth rocks, reflecting the rising moon in broken silver patches. Hannah had just finished her chores when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to find Isaac standing a few feet away, his expression unusually uncertain. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Hannah gestured to the grassy bank beside her. "Please do." He sat down, leaving a respectful distance between them. For several minutes they simply watched the water in companionable silence. Then Isaac spoke, his voice barely audible above the gentle current. "You were right earlier, about the truth being complicated." He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "When I offered you passage to Oregon, it was a simple decision. You needed help and I could provide it. I didn't anticipate." He hesitated. "That we might come to mean something to each other," Hannah suggested gently. Isaac nodded, his eyes still on the flowing water. "I've spent 5 years avoiding attachments, convincing myself that the trail is all I need. Then you appeared at that well in Idaho City, and suddenly—" He trailed off, seeming unable to articulate the transformation. Hannah waited, her heart beating faster with each moment of silence. "I'm not good with words, Hannah," Isaac finally continued. "Not like you. But I need you to know that whatever happens when we reach Oregon, these weeks with you have changed me. You've made me question choices I thought were settled long ago." He turned to face her then, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. "I can't offer you promises right now. My life, my work, it's all I've known for years. But I don't want to simply deliver you to your aunt and ride away without acknowledging what's grown between us." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes at his honesty. "Isaac, I don't expect promises. I came west seeking independence, a chance to build my own life away from others' expectations. I understand the value of that freedom." "Then what do you want?" he asked quietly. She considered the question carefully. "Time. Not forever, just enough to know if what we feel is real or simply born of unusual circumstances. Enough to see if there's a future where both our needs could be met." Isaac reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through her. "That seems reasonable," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Though I'm not sure anything about how I feel for you is reasonable." Hannah smiled through unshed tears. "Perhaps that's not such a bad thing." In the silver moonlight, Isaac's face softened. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, his lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it made her heart ache. A question more than a demand, an offering rather than a taking. Hannah responded with the same gentle certainty, her free hand rising to rest against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, strong and slightly rapid. The kiss deepened gradually, becoming more certain as they discovered each other in this new way. When they finally drew apart, Isaac rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "I've been wanting to do that since you stood up to those men at the well," he admitted. Hannah laughed softly. "Even covered in dust and half dead from thirst." "Even then," he confirmed with a smile that transformed his usually serious features. "You were magnificent, terrified but refusing to show it. I knew then you were someone extraordinary." They remained by the river for nearly an hour, talking quietly about small, personal things, favorite memories from childhood, books that had shaped their thinking, simple pleasures they'd missed during their respective journeys. It was the kind of conversation that builds intimacy through shared confidences, rather than grand declarations. When they finally returned to camp, the men pretended not to notice their linked hands or the new ease between them, though Hannah caught Samuel giving Isaac a subtle nod of approval as they passed his bedroll. The following days brought a new dimension to their journey. While Isaac remained focused on the practical challenges of moving the herd safely through increasingly populated territory, there was an undeniable shift in his demeanor, a lightness that hadn't been there before, moments of quiet laughter that surprised even his men. For Hannah, each day brought the bittersweet awareness that their journey would soon end. Oregon was less than a week away now, and though she and Isaac had acknowledged their feelings, they had made no concrete plans for what would happen when they reached her aunt's homestead. The question became unavoidable when, 4 days from the Oregon border, they encountered a postal rider who carried news that would alter their carefully developing relationship. The rider, a weathered man named Barnes who supplemented his postal income by carrying private messages between settlements, recognized Isaac from previous encounters on the trail. "Jensen, thought that might be your outfit when I spotted the herd." He dismounted, accepting the coffee Hannah offered with grateful thanks. "Been looking for you since boys. Got a message from your buyer in Portland." Isaac frowned. "Carmichael, what does he want?" Barnes pulled a sealed letter from his saddlebag. "Says he needs the cattle 2 weeks earlier than planned. Something about a contract with the Army." Isaac broke the seal, reading quickly. His expression darkened as he absorbed the contents. "He's right. There's a new fort being established near the Columbia River. They're purchasing supplies now instead of next month." He folded the letter, his movements precise with suppressed tension. "We need to push harder, take the northern route straight to Portland instead of going through Baker City." Hannah felt the implication immediately. Baker City, where her aunt lived, would now be well out of their way. The detour to deliver her there would cost Isaac precious time, possibly jeopardizing his contract. "How much time would it cost to take me to my aunt's first?" she asked quietly. Isaac met her eyes, conflicted. 3, maybe 4 days. Time we don't have if we're going to make Portland by Carmichael's new deadline." The men exchanged uncomfortable glances, aware of the difficult choice their boss now faced. "There's a stagecoach route from Union to Baker City," Barnes offered helpfully. "Runs twice weekly. If the lady could get to Union, she'd have a safe passage the rest of the way." "How far is Union from your route to Portland?" Hannah asked, already calculating alternatives in her mind. Isaac studied the map. "Half a day's ride east of where we'd turn north. We could get you there without losing much time." Hannah nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. The practical solution was clear, even if it meant cutting short the time she and Isaac had hoped for. "Then that's what we should do." Isaac looked as if he wanted to argue, but the responsibilities of his position weighed heavily. "I'll heavily escort you from Union to the stagecoach station. Make sure you're safely aboard before he rejoins us." "I'll be fine on my own," Hannah insisted. "You need every man to move the herd quickly." "No." Isaac's tone brooked no argument. "I won't leave you unprotected, not even for a day. If he goes with you, that's final." Hannah recognized the mixture of concern and frustration in his voice. Later, when they had a moment alone as the others broke camp, she approached him where he stood checking his saddle. "Isaac, I understand. Your business, your men, they depend on you making the right decisions." He turned to her, his expression torn. "This isn't how I wanted things to end between us." "Who says they're ending?" Hannah challenged gently. "This is just an unexpected detour." Isaac's hand came up to cup her cheek. "You continue to surprise me, Hannah James. Most women would be furious that I'm choosing cattle over them." "I'm not most women," she reminded him with a small smile. "And you're not choosing cattle over me, you're honoring your commitments as any honorable man would." She placed her hand over his. "Besides, my aunt's home is hardly the end of the world. Portland isn't so very far from Baker City." The implication hung between them that this separation needn't be permanent, that there might be a future beyond their journey together. Isaac's eyes searched hers. "You'd consider seeing me again after I've completed this contract?" "I'd be disappointed if you didn't at least ask," Hannah admitted. "We agreed we needed time to see if what we feel is real. I'm still interested in discovering that answer. Something like hope flickered across his face. As am I. The altered plans meant pushing the cattle harder than before. Isaac drove the herd, and his men from sunrise until well past dusk each day, determined to make up time without sacrificing the animal's condition. Hannah marveled at his stamina, and the way the men responded to his leadership, complaining good-naturedly about the pace, but working harder than ever to meet his expectations. On the evening before they would reach Union, the group made camp earlier than usual beside a clear stream where the cattle could rest and drink before the final push. After a hearty dinner that Hannah prepared with special care, knowing it might be their last meal together for some time, Isaac suggested they walk a little way from camp. They followed the stream to where it widened into a small pool surrounded by cottonwood trees. The setting sun painted the water gold and orange, a peaceful scene at odds with the emotions churning inside Hannah. "I've been thinking," Isaac said after they had walked in silence for several minutes, "about what happens after Portland." Hannah's heart quickened. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That I'm tired of letting the past dictate my future." Isaac's voice was firm with new resolve. "For years I've been running from memories, from connections, from the possibility of loss, but meeting you has shown me what I've been missing." He turned to face her fully. "I can't promise to settle down immediately. This cattle business, it's my livelihood, and I have responsibilities to my men. But I could base myself somewhere permanent between drives, somewhere like Baker City, perhaps." Hannah stared at him, scarcely believing what she was hearing. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I want to court you properly, Hannah James." Isaac took both her hands in his. "Not on the trail, not in stolen moments between crises, but in a way that gives us both the chance to truly know each other. If that's something you might want as well." Joy bloomed in Hannah's chest, so intense it almost hurt. "Isaac Jensen, that is most definitely something I want." His smile, then full and unguarded, was like sunrise after a storm. He gathered her close, his kiss conveying what words could not: promise, passion, and the certainty that what they'd found together was worth pursuing, whatever challenges might lie ahead. When they returned to camp, their decision made and their hearts lighter despite the impending separation, they found the men gathered in serious conversation around the fire. William rose as they approached, his expression grave. "Ryder came through while you were gone, boss. Bad news. Blackwood's gang was spotted near Union yesterday. They robbed the very stagecoach line Miss Hannah would be taking." Hannah felt Isaac's body tense beside her. "Anyone hurt?" he asked sharply. William nodded grimly. "Driver was shot when he resisted. Passenger 2, an older man who tried to protect his wife. Both survived, but it was close." "Did they catch Blackwood?" Isaac's voice was tight with controlled anger. "No. Ryder said the local sheriff organized a posse, but Blackwood and his men disappeared into the hills. They think he's heading north, possibly toward the same areas we'll be passing through." The implications hung heavily in the air. The northern route to Portland would take them through remote terrain perfect for an ambush by men who knew the territory and were desperate enough to kill. "We can't send Miss Hannah on the stagecoach now," Samuel said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Not with Blackwood targeting that very line. Nor can we take her through territory where he might be hiding," Isaac agreed, his arm tightening protectively around Hannah's waist. The whole situation's changed. Hannah looked around at the concerned faces of men who had become like family over their weeks of travel together. "What are our options?" she asked practically. Isaac considered for a long moment. "We need a new plan. One that keeps both Hannah and the herd safe while still meeting our deadline." He turned to William. How far off our route is the Jensen Ranch? William looked surprised. Your family's place, about a day's ride north of Union. But I thought, I know what I said before, Isaac interrupted. But circumstances have changed. Hannah needs somewhere safe to wait until Blackwood is caught or moves on. My parents' ranch is the most secure location I can think of. Hannah stared at him in astonishment. In all their conversations, Isaac had never mentioned that his family still maintained a ranch in the territory. Your parents? I thought they moved west after my sister died, Isaac explained quietly. Couldn't bear to stay on the Indiana farm with so many memories. My father bought land in Oregon 5 years ago. I helped them establish the ranch before returning to the cattle drives. But you never visit them, Samuel observed with the frankness of long acquaintance. Not in all the years I've known you. Isaac's jaw tightened. We've had our differences. But they'd never turn away someone in need, especially not. He hesitated, glancing at Hannah. Especially not someone important to me. The implications of this statement weren't lost on anyone present. Hannah felt both touched by his willingness to breach the estrangement with his family for her sake, and concerned about the emotional cost such a reunion might exact. Are you certain about this? She asked softly. I wouldn't want to be the cause of painful memories. Isaac's expression was resolute. Some pain needs to be faced eventually. Maybe it's time I stopped running from the past. The decision made, they adjusted their plans once more. Isaac would escort Hannah to his parents' ranch himself, while the men continued with the herd at a slower pace. He would rejoin them afterward, and they would make up time by traveling through the night if necessary to reach Portland by their deadline. As they prepared for sleep, Hannah found herself filled with a strange mixture of apprehension and anticipation. Tomorrow would bring not just another leg of her journey, but a glimpse into the family Isaac had deliberately separated himself from, the people who had shaped him before grief and war had redrawn the contours of his life. Dawn brought clear skies and a tense energy to the camp as Isaac prepared for their side journey. He selected his fastest horse for Hannah and packed supplies sufficient for several days, though the ranch was only a day's ride away. Precautions, he explained as he secured an extra revolver in his saddlebag. I don't anticipate trouble, but with Blackwood in the area, I'm not taking chances. The men gathered to see them off, each offering Hannah a personal farewell. Illy, disappointed that he wouldn't be her escort as originally planned, extracted a promise that she would save him a dance at the Harvest Festival if he made it to Baker City in the fall. Take care of our cook, William told Isaac with gruff affection. Best trail food I've had in 20 years of driving cattle. I will, Isaac promised solemnly. Keep the herd moving steady. I'll catch up within 2 days. As they rode away, Hannah glanced back to see the 4 men standing together, watching until a bend in the trail obscured them from view. They're good men, she observed. You've chosen your crew well. They're the closest thing to family I've allowed myself in years, Isaac admitted, though I've never told them so. Perhaps you should, Hannah suggested gently. Life is uncertain, as we've both learned. Better to speak truths while we can. Isaac considered this in silence as they rode. The trail he chose skirted the main roads, following instead the natural contours of the land through forests and across meadows. By midday, they had climbed to a ridge that offered spectacular views of the valley below and mountains beyond. Oregon, Isaac said, gesturing toward the distant peaks. You can see why people are willing to endure so much to reach it. Land so rich and beautiful it almost hurts to look at it. Hannah followed his gaze, understanding the reverence in his voice. After the hardships of their journey, the verdant landscape before them seemed almost mythical in its abundance. Your parents chose well for their new beginning. Isaac nodded, something wistful crossing his features. My father always had an eye for good land. The ranch has prospered under his management, from what I hear. When did you last see them? Hannah asked carefully. 3 years ago. I helped drive a small herd to a neighboring ranch, stopped by briefly to ensure they were well established. His expression closed slightly. It was difficult, too many unspoken accusations hanging in the air. About Elizabeth and David, about choices, mine, theirs, words said and unsaid in grief. Isaac urged his horse forward, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. We should keep moving. I want to reach the ranch before nightfall. They rode in companionable silence for several hours, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat a simple lunch. As the afternoon progressed, Hannah noticed Isaac growing increasingly tense, his posture more rigid, his responses to her occasional comments more clipped. By late afternoon, they descended into a broad valley where stands of pine gave way to carefully maintained pastures. In the distance, a substantial log house stood on a gentle rise, smoke curling from its chimney into the clear blue sky. Outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn, bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a workshop or smithy. The Jensen Ranch, Isaac said unnecessarily, reining in his horse to survey the property from a distance. His expression was unreadable, but Hannah noted how his knuckles whitened where he gripped the reins. It's beautiful, she said truthfully. The setting was idyllic, protected by hills on 3 sides, with a stream running along the eastern boundary and lush grazing land extending to the south. Your parents have built something remarkable here. Yes, Isaac agreed, his voice distant. They always do. Before Hannah could respond to this cryptic comment, a figure emerged from the barn, a tall man in work clothes who shaded his eyes to peer in their direction. After a moment, he raised an arm in greeting, evidently recognizing Isaac even at this distance. That's my father, Isaac said, a complex emotion threading through his voice. Looks like our arrival won't be a complete surprise. They continued down the slope toward the ranch, and as they drew closer, Hannah could see others emerging from the house and outbuildings, a woman in an apron who must be Isaac's mother, and 2 young men who moved with the confident stride of experienced ranch hands. Isaac's father waited for them at the gate to the main yard, his stance mirroring his son's so exactly that Hannah was struck by the resemblance. Though his hair was silver rather than dark brown, and deep lines marked a face weathered by sun and wind, the same strong features and watchful eyes were unmistakable. Isaac, the older man said as they drew up before him, this is unexpected. Hello, father. Isaac dismounted, his movements precise as if following an uncertain protocol. I apologize for arriving without warning. Circumstances made it necessary. His father's gaze shifted to Hannah, curiosity evident in his assessment. I see that. And who might this young lady be? Isaac helped Hannah down from her horse, his hand lingering supportively at her waist. This is Miss Hannah James. She's traveling to her aunt's home near Baker City. Hannah, my father, Joseph Jensen. Mr. Jensen, Hannah greeted him with a respectful nod. I'm sorry to impose on your hospitality in this manner. Joseph Jensen's stern expression softened slightly. Any friend of my son's is welcome here, Miss James, especially one who's managed to bring him to our door after so long an absence. By now, Isaac's mother had reached them, wiping her hands on her apron as she hurried across the yard. She was a small woman with Isaac's dark eyes and a face that must once have been quite beautiful before time and hardship had left their marks. Isaac. Her voice held disbelief, as if she feared her eyes might be deceiving her. Is it really you? Something in Isaac's rigid posture gave way at the sound of his mother's voice. Hello, mother, She moved forward hesitantly, then with sudden decision threw her arms around her son. After a moment's stiffness, Isaac returned the embrace, his eyes closing briefly over her shoulder in an expression of complex emotion. When they separated, his mother immediately turned her attention to Hannah. "And who is this lovely young woman?" Isaac repeated the introduction, explaining briefly that circumstances had made it necessary to seek temporary shelter for Hannah until the danger from Blackwood's gang had passed. "Blackwood?" Joseph's expression darkened. "Curtis Blackwood, the bank robber?" Isaac nodded grimly. "The same. He's operating in the region, targeting stagecoaches and travelers. Hannah was to take the Union stage to Baker City, but after the recent robbery, it's too dangerous. Of course she'll stay with us," Isaac's mother declared immediately, "for as long as necessary." "I'm Margaret Jensen, my dear," she added, taking Hannah's hands in her own. "And you must be exhausted from your journey. Come inside where it's comfortable." As Margaret led Hannah toward the house, Hannah glanced back to see father and son standing in the yard, their postures identical in their mutual discomfort. She sent a silent prayer that this unexpected reunion might heal rather than deepen the wounds between them. The house was as impressive inside as out, spacious rooms filled with a mixture of sturdy frontier furniture and finer pieces that must have been brought from Indiana. Margaret showed Hannah to a pleasant bedroom on the upper floor, explaining that it had been Elizabeth's room in the brief time she'd visited the ranch before her death. "I keep it ready, though we have few visitors this far from the main roads," Margaret said, her fingers trailing lovingly over a handmade quilt. "Elizabeth loved color, said there was too little of it during the war years." Hannah felt the weight of being placed in a room so laden with memory. "Mrs. Jensen, if it's painful for you or for Isaac to have me in Elizabeth's room—" "No, child," Margaret interrupted gently. "It does my heart good to see life in this room again. Elizabeth would have liked you, I think. She had the same directness in her eyes." After showing Hannah where to find fresh water and towels, Margaret left her to rest before dinner. Alone for the first time in weeks, Hannah took the opportunity to wash away the dust of travel and change into her cleanest remaining dress, a simple blue cotton that Mrs. Thornton had included among the clothing she'd given her. From her window, she could see the ranch yard where Isaac and his father were deep in conversation near the corral. Though she couldn't hear their words, their body language suggested the discussion was intense, but not hostile. As she watched, Joseph placed a hand on Isaac's shoulder, a gesture that seemed to surprise his son, before they turned together toward the barn. Dinner that evening was a curious blend of awkward silences and moments of unexpected warmth. Margaret had prepared a feast that spoke eloquently of her desire to welcome her son home: roast chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from her garden, and a berry pie that Isaac commented was just as good as I remembered. The simple compliment brought tears to Margaret's eyes that she quickly blinked away. "Your father shot the grouse himself yesterday, almost as if he knew we'd have cause to celebrate." "Not celebration, precisely," Joseph corrected, though his tone was gentle, "but certainly welcome company. It's been too quiet here since Thomas and James left for California last spring." "The Alderson boys," Margaret explained to Hannah. "They worked for us since we established the ranch. Fine young men, but the gold fever finally caught them. We've managed with just Luke and Caleb since then," she added, referring to the two young ranch hands Hannah had seen earlier. As the meal progressed, Hannah learned more about the Jensen Ranch and how it had developed over the past 5 years. Joseph had chosen the location specifically for its water access and natural protection from the harsh winter storms that sometimes swept through the territory. They raised primarily horses rather than cattle, breeding sturdy stock well suited to the demanding terrain. "We've built something good here," Joseph said, his eyes meeting Isaac's across the table. "Something that will last." The unspoken question hung in the air whether Isaac might ever consider being part of that legacy. Hannah watched as Isaac acknowledged his father's words with a slight nod, neither accepting nor rejecting the implicit invitation. After dinner, as Margaret served coffee in the comfortable sitting room, the conversation turned to Hannah's plans. She explained about her aunt near Baker City, the teaching position she hoped to secure, and her journey from Missouri after her father's death, though she omitted the more desperate circumstances of her departure. "And how did you come to be traveling with my son's cattle drive?" Joseph asked, his shrewd eyes moving between Hannah and Isaac. An unusual arrangement, to say the least. Hannah hesitated, unsure how much Isaac would want revealed about their meeting in Idaho City. To her surprise, he answered directly. "Hannah was in trouble when we met. Some men were harassing her at the town well. I intervened." Isaac's tone was matter-of-fact, but his eyes held Hannah's with a warmth that belied his casual account. "When I learned she was traveling alone to Oregon, I offered the protection of my outfit." "That was good of you," Margaret said, watching her son with keen assessment. "Though not entirely surprising, you never could abide seeing someone vulnerable mistreated, even as a boy." Isaac shifted uncomfortably under this maternal insight. It was the decent thing to do, nothing more. "And yet," Joseph observed shrewdly, "you've brought Miss James to your family home rather than continuing with your herd a decision that must impact your delivery schedule significantly." Hannah felt a flush rising to her cheeks at the implication in Joseph's words. Isaac, too, seemed caught off guard by his father's directness. "Blackwood's gang made the stagecoach option too dangerous," he replied after a moment. "And I couldn't in good conscience leave Hannah unprotected or take her through territory where armed criminals might be hiding." "Of course not," Margaret agreed quickly, casting a warning glance at her husband. "You did exactly right, Isaac, and we're delighted to have Miss James stay with us until it's safe for her to continue her journey." The conversation moved to safer topics after that local news. Developments in the territory's governance, the prospects for the coming winter. Yet Hannah remained aware of the undercurrents flowing beneath the polite exchange, Joseph's careful assessment of his son's attachment to her, Margaret's barely concealed hope that this visit might mark a change in their estranged relationship, and Isaac's own struggle to navigate the complex emotions of returning to his family home. Later, as the evening drew to a close, Isaac walked Hannah to the foot of the stairs that led to her room. They had a brief moment of privacy while his parents remained in the sitting room. "I'm sorry if today has been difficult," Hannah said softly. "Coming here, facing your parents again, I know it wasn't what you planned." Isaac shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes the things we avoid most are exactly what we need to face." He took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Rest well, Hannah. Tomorrow I'll ride out to check on the herd and make sure the men are managing without me. I should be back by nightfall." "And after that?" Hannah asked, the question encompassing far more than his immediate plans. Isaac seemed to understand the deeper inquiry. "After that, we take each day as it comes. But I meant what I said before about courting you properly, about finding a way to build something between us that isn't dictated by the past or by fear." His words filled Hannah with quiet joy. "I'll hold you to that promise, Isaac Jensen." He smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "I'm counting on it, Hannah James." With a gentle squeeze of her hand, he released her and watched as she climbed the stairs to her temporary room in his childhood home, a convergence of past and potential future that neither could have imagined when they'd met at that well in Idaho City. The next several days established a new rhythm for Hannah at the Jensen ranch. While Isaac rode out each morning to check on his herd's progress and coordinate with his men, Hannah found herself welcomed into the daily routines of ranch life. Margaret taught her to make preserves from the summer berries, showed her the vegetable garden that supplied most of their needs, and shared stories of the family's early days in Oregon. To Hannah's surprise, Joseph proved equally welcoming in his own gruff way. Learning that she had some experience with bookkeeping from helping her father's business, he invited her to review the ranch accounts, valuing her suggestions for organizing their records more efficiently. "You've a good head for figures," he commented one afternoon as they worked together in his small office, "and a practical understanding of business that's uncommon in young women. My father believed daughters should be educated as thoroughly as sons," Hannah explained. "He said ignorance was a prison he wouldn't condemn me to, regardless of social conventions." Joseph nodded approvingly. "A wise man, your father. My Elizabeth was the same always, with her nose in a book, questioning everything, learning for the pure joy of knowing." It was the first time he had mentioned his daughter directly to Hannah, and she recognized the significance of his willingness to speak of her. "Isaac has told me a little about her. She sounds like someone I would have admired greatly." "She was extraordinary," Joseph said quietly, his weathered hands stilling on the ledger before him. "Her death broke something in all of us. Margaret and I eventually found our way forward, but Isaac—" He shook his head. "My son carries guilt that isn't his to bear." Hannah considered her response carefully. "He feels he failed her and David by not being there when they needed him. Yes, a burden he refuses to set down." Joseph's eyes, so like his son's, held a similar pain. "What he doesn't understand is that Elizabeth would have been devastated to know her death became a chain binding him to the past. She wanted joy for him always. It was the last thing she wrote to me before she died." This revelation touched Hannah deeply. "Perhaps someday he'll be ready to hear that." Joseph studied her thoughtfully. "Perhaps, and perhaps you might be the one to help him see it." The implication was clear. Joseph had recognized the connection between Hannah and his son, and rather than disapproving, he seemed cautiously supportive. It was a vote of confidence Hannah hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. Each evening when Isaac returned, Hannah observed the gradual thawing between him and his parents. Conversations that had initially been stilted became more natural. Shared memories emerged not just of Elizabeth, but of happier times from Isaac's childhood, stories that revealed the close-knit family they had once been. On the fourth evening, after Margaret had retired early with a headache, Hannah sat on the front porch watching as Isaac and his father inspected a new foal born that morning. The two men moved with identical grace around the nervous mare, their hands gentle but confident as they checked the gangly-legged colt. "He has a gift with horses," Joseph remarked when he joined Hannah later, watching his son continue to work in the barn. "Always did, even as a boy. Could gentle the wildest colt when grown men couldn't get near." "He has a similar effect on people," Hannah observed. "His men follow him without question, not from fear but from respect." Joseph nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "He learned leadership in the hardest school imaginable. The war changed him, hardened him in some ways, but it didn't destroy the fundamental goodness in him." "No," Hannah agreed softly. "It didn't." As Joseph excused himself to check on Margaret, Isaac emerged from the barn and crossed the yard toward the porch. Moonlight silvered his dark hair and cast his features in dramatic relief. Hannah was struck anew by his physical presence, the easy strength in his movements, the alertness in his posture that never quite disappeared even in moments of relaxation. "The colt's strong," he reported as he sat beside her on the porch step. "Good bloodlines. He'll fetch a good price when he's trained. Your father is proud of what you've accomplished," Hannah said, watching his profile in the dim light. "Not just with the ranch, but with your own business, the man you've become." Isaac was quiet for a long moment. "We've begun to really talk these past days, things that have gone unsaid for too long." He turned to her, his expression open in a way it rarely was. "It's because of you, Hannah. Bringing you here forced me to face what I've been avoiding for years." "I've done nothing but be myself," Hannah protested gently. "And that has been everything," Isaac replied, reaching for her hand. "Your courage in starting over, your willingness to face difficult truths, it shames me to realize how long I've been hiding from my own past." They sat in companionable silence, hands linked, as night settled fully around them. From inside the house came the soft sound of Margaret moving about the kitchen, preparing for the next day's baking. In the distance, coyotes called to one another across the valley. "I received word today," Isaac said finally. "Blackwood and his gang were captured near the Columbia River. Tried to rob a payroll shipment, ran into a detachment of cavalry by mistake. No one was killed, but they won't be troubling these territories again." Hannah absorbed this news, understanding its implications. "So the stagecoach route to Baker City is safe again?" "Yes." Isaac's fingers tightened around hers. "I've fulfilled my contract obligations as well. The herd reached Portland yesterday, 2 days ahead of Carmichael's revised schedule. William and the men handled the final drive perfectly." "That's wonderful news," Hannah said, genuinely pleased for him. "Your business reputation remains intact." "It does." Isaac shifted to face her more directly. "Which means I'm free of immediate obligations. Free to accompany you to Baker City myself if you'll allow it." Hannah's heart quickened at the thought of continuing their journey together. "I'd like that very much." "There's more," Isaac continued, an uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. "I've been thinking about what happens after we reach your aunt's home. About my future, our future, if you're willing." Hannah waited, hardly daring to breathe as Isaac gathered his thoughts. "My father has offered me a partnership in the ranch," he said finally. "Not just as his son, but as a businessman who can help expand their horse breeding operation. He believes my experience with the cattle drives gives me valuable connections throughout the territories." "That's a generous offer," Hannah observed, careful not to influence his decision. "How do you feel about it?" Conflicted, tempted, terrified. Isaac gave a short laugh, all at once. "For so long I've defined myself by my independence, by having no permanent ties. And now I find myself wanting things I never thought I would again: a home, a future, someone to share it with." His eyes held hers, vulnerable and sincere. "You, Hannah, if you could consider a life here in Oregon, perhaps not at the ranch itself, but nearby Baker City is less than 2 days' ride. I could divide my time, help my father while maintaining my own business interests." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes at the earnestness of his proposal. "Are you asking me to marry you, Isaac Jensen?" "Not yet," he replied with unexpected honesty. "That would be premature for both of us. I'm asking for the chance to court you properly, to build something lasting between us without the pressures of the trail or the uncertainties of our initial circumstances. I'm asking if you could imagine a future where our paths remain connected, even as we each pursue our own dreams." The thoughtfulness of his proposal, acknowledging both their growing feelings and their need for individual fulfillment, touched Hannah deeply. It was exactly the kind of partnership she had hoped for but never expected to find. "Yes," she said simply. "I can imagine that future, Isaac." In fact, I've been imagining little else these past weeks. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. He drew her close, his kiss conveying the promise and possibility that words could only approximate. Hannah responded with equal fervor, her arms twining around his neck as she allowed herself to fully embrace the future opening before them. When they finally separated, breathless and laughing softly in the darkness, Isaac pressed his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find you, Hannah James. Never thought I'd want to be found." "Sometimes," Hannah replied, echoing words she had spoken weeks earlier. "What we're looking for finds us when we least expect it." The journey to Baker City 2 days later was unlike any traveling they had done before. With no cattle to drive, no deadlines to meet, and no dangers pursuing them, Isaac and Hannah were free to enjoy the spectacular Oregon landscape at a leisurely pace. They rode side by side along well-maintained roads, talking and laughing with the easy companionship that had developed between them. Margaret had packed a generous basket of provisions for Hannah to take to her aunt, along with a letter introducing herself and expressing hope for future acquaintance between the families. Joseph had added a bottle of fine whiskey for the aunt's gentleman friend, should she have one, with a wink that made Isaac roll his eyes good-naturedly. The farewell at the Jensen ranch had been emotional but not final. Hannah had promised to write regularly, and plans were already forming for a visit during the harvest season. Joseph had clasped his son's hand firmly before pulling him into a brief, powerful embrace that spoke volumes about the healing that had begun between them. "You'll always have a home here," he had said gruffly. "Both of you, whenever you wish it." Now, as they approached Baker City in the golden light of late afternoon, Hannah felt a curious mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She had not seen her aunt in 8 years. What if the woman no longer welcomed her? What if the letter Hannah had sent announcing her impending arrival had never reached its destination? Isaac seemed to sense her anxiety. "Your aunt will be delighted to see you," he reassured her. "Who wouldn't be?" Hannah smiled gratefully at his support. "I'm being foolish, I know. It's just everything feels so uncertain still. I left Missouri with nothing but hope and determination. Now I have so much more to lose." "Not lose," Isaac corrected gently. "Risk, perhaps. But that's the nature of truly living, isn't it? Nothing worthwhile comes without some element of risk." As they rode into Baker City, Hannah was struck by how established the settlement appeared compared to the rough mining towns they had passed through. Clean, orderly streets lined with a mixture of wooden buildings and more substantial brick structures spoke of a community that had moved beyond its frontier beginnings toward permanence. Her aunt's home proved easy to find, a tidy cottage on the eastern edge of town, with a well-tended garden and fresh white paint. As they dismounted before the small gate, the front door opened to reveal a woman in her early 50s, her graying blonde hair swept up in a simple knot, her face showing the same delicate features Hannah had inherited from her own mother. "Hannah," the woman called, shading her eyes against the setting sun. "Hannah James, is that truly you, Aunt Harriet?" Hannah confirmed, suddenly overwhelmed with emotion at the familiar face so like her mother's that it brought an ache to her chest. "Yes, it's me." Harriet James hurried down the garden path, arms outstretched to embrace her niece. "My dear girl, your letter arrived just last week. I've been watching the road every day since, hoping you'd appear." She held Hannah at arm's length, examining her with affectionate scrutiny. "You look so much like your mother it takes my breath away." Hannah blinked back tears, the weeks of tension and uncertainty finally catching up with her now that she had reached her destination safely. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me. It's been so long." "Remember you?" My only sister's only child. What nonsense! Harriet hugged her again, then turned her attention to Isaac, who had been quietly unloading Hannah's few possessions from the horses. And who is this gentleman? Hannah made the introductions, explaining briefly how Isaac had come to her rescue in Idaho City and ensured her safe passage to Oregon. What she couldn't properly convey in that simple account was everything that had developed between them since the trust, the deepening affection, the promises for a shared future. Harriet, however, seemed to read between the lines with the perception of someone well-versed in matters of the heart. "Mr. Jensen," she said warmly, extending her hand, "I owe you a debt I can never repay for bringing my niece safely to me. Please, you must stay for dinner at the very least, and I insist you accept my hospitality for the night before your return journey." Isaac accepted graciously, and soon they were settled in Harriet's comfortable parlor while she prepared a welcoming meal. Hannah discovered that her aunt had established herself quite well in Baker City, teaching at the local school for several years, before recently retiring to focus on her true passion for botanical illustration. Her detailed drawings of native plants had attracted attention from scientific societies back east, providing her with a modest but steady income that supplemented her teacher's pension. "I've lived simply, but happily," Harriet explained as they enjoyed a delicious dinner of roast chicken and vegetables from her garden. "And I've room enough for you to stay as long as you wish, my dear. In fact, I've already spoken to the school board about you. They're most interested in meeting a qualified young teacher from the East." "You've done so much already," Hannah said, touched by her aunt's thoughtfulness. "I had hoped to find work, but wasn't sure what opportunities might exist." "Baker City is growing rapidly," Harriet assured her. "There's need for educated young women not just as teachers, but in the new library, the newspaper office, even the territorial land office has begun hiring female clerks." Her eyes twinkled as she glanced between Hannah and Isaac. "Of course, you might find yourself with other plans entirely before long." Hannah felt herself blushing at her aunt's perceptiveness. "Aunt Harriet." "Oh, my dear, I may be unmarried, but I'm not blind," Harriet laughed. "The way Mr. Jensen looks at you tells its own story. And a fine-looking story it is, if I may say so." Now it was Isaac's turn to appear slightly discomfited, though his eyes held Hannah's with unmistakable warmth across the table. "Miss James is correct that I hold her in the highest regard," he acknowledged. "Though we've agreed that any formal arrangements would be premature at this stage." "Sensible," Harriet nodded approvingly. "The best foundations are built slowly and with care. Though I hope, Mr. Jensen, that your business will bring you to Baker City with some regularity in the coming months." "I believe it will," Isaac replied with a smile. "In fact, I've recently entered into a partnership that will require frequent travel between Portland and these eastern territories. Baker City would make an excellent stopping point." The conversation continued pleasantly through the evening, with Harriet proving to be exactly the kind, intelligent woman Hannah remembered from her childhood visits. By the time they retired for the night, Hannah to the cozy guest room that would now be hers, and Isaac to the small but comfortable study that Harriet had hastily converted to a temporary bedchamber, Hannah felt the last of her uncertainty dissolve. She had found not just a safe haven, but a place where she could truly build the independent life she had dreamed of, with the added blessing of family, opportunity, and a man who understood her need for both security and freedom. The following morning dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of perfect late summer day that seemed designed for new beginnings. After breakfast, Isaac announced that he should start back toward his parents' ranch, where business matters awaited his attention. Harriet tactfully excused herself to visit a neighbor, giving Hannah and Isaac a chance for a private farewell in the garden behind the cottage. Surrounded by late blooming flowers and the gentle buzzing of bees, they stood facing each other, hands linked, neither eager to part but both understanding the necessity. "I'll return in 3 weeks," Isaac promised. "Sooner if I can manage it. I've arrangements to make with the ranch, contracts to negotiate in Portland, but none of that will keep me away longer than absolutely necessary." Hannah squeezed his hands, savoring these last moments together. "I'll be here, building my own life as we discussed. Aunt Harriet says the school board meets next week. I may have a position by the time you return." "Teacher James," Isaac smiled. "It suits you." "As Rancher Jensen suits you," Hannah returned. "Your father was right about your gift with horses. You belong on that land, Isaac, at least part of the time. I'm glad you're giving it a chance." Isaac's expression grew serious. "I'm giving everything a chance, Hannah. A home, a family connection, a future that isn't defined by running from the past." He raised a hand to cup her cheek. "All because a brave woman from Missouri decided to start over and showed me it was possible to do the same." Hannah leaned into his touch, her heart full. "We'll build something wonderful, Isaac, not just together but each in our own way. That's what makes it right. We're choosing each other freely, not out of desperation or fear." "Freely and fully," Isaac agreed, drawing her closer. His kiss was both a promise and a pledge, tender yet passionate. Speaking of a future, they would forge together while respecting each other's independence. When they finally parted, it was with the certainty that this separation was merely temporary, a necessary pause in a journey they had only just begun. Hannah stood at the garden gate, watching as Isaac mounted his horse and turned toward the western trail that would take him back to the Jensen ranch. He paused at the crest of the hill overlooking Baker City, raising his hand in a final farewell before disappearing from sight. Hannah remained there for several moments after he had gone, her heart full of gratitude for the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with a desperate stop at a well in Idaho City and led to this new beginning in Oregon. 5 rough men had surrounded her that day, threatening everything she valued, when a quiet cowboy had appeared from nowhere to say, "She's done here," simple words that had changed the course of her life forever. With a smile of anticipation for all that lay ahead, Hannah turned back toward her aunt's cottage, her home now, to begin the next chapter of her story. Epilogue. 1 year later, the Autumn Fair in Baker City had become the social event of the season, drawing visitors from throughout the eastern Oregon territories. Booths lined the main street, offering everything from handcrafted goods to agricultural displays, while competitions for the finest livestock and produce created friendly rivalry among local ranchers and farmers. Hannah Jensen moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting former students and parents with the confident warmth she had developed during her successful first year teaching at the Baker City School. Her blue dress, made especially for the occasion, complemented the gold wedding band that now graced her left hand, a simple circle engraved with intertwining vines that Isaac had selected 6 months earlier, when they had exchanged vows in a small ceremony at the Jensen Ranch. They had courted properly, as Isaac had promised, with regular visits throughout the autumn and winter months as Hannah established herself in Baker City, and Isaac divided his time between his cattle business and his partnership in his parents' horse breeding operation. By spring, they had been certain of their feelings and their compatibility, ready to commit to a future that honored both their independence and their deep connection. Now Hannah paused at the edge of the fairground, searching the crowd for her husband. She found him exactly where she expected, at the livestock judging area, where Joseph Jensen was proudly displaying a magnificent black stallion bred at their ranch. Isaac stood beside his father, their similar profiles striking as they pointed out the horse's finer points to the admiring judges. The sight of father and son working together still filled Hannah with quiet joy. The healing that had begun during her stay at the ranch had deepened over the months, with Isaac gradually reclaiming his place in the family while maintaining the independence that was essential to his nature. They had found a balance that worked 3 weeks of each month at their own small homestead near Baker City, where Hannah continued teaching and Isaac managed his cattle contracts, and 1 week at the Jensen Ranch, where both contributed to the family business that was now thriving under their collaborative efforts. "There you are." Harriet appeared at Hannah's side, carrying a basket filled with ribbons from the botanical display where her illustrations had once again taken first prize. "I've been looking everywhere. Margaret wants us both for the pie judging in 10 minutes. Hannah laughed, allowing her aunt to link arms with her as they navigated through the crowded fairground. "I wouldn't miss it. Though I'm not sure I should be judging anything in my condition, everything tastes wonderful to me lately." Harriet's eyes twinkled as she glanced at her niece's still flat stomach. "Has Isaac stopped grinning yet? When you told him the news last week, I thought his face might split in two from sheer happiness." "Not entirely," Hannah admitted with a smile. "Though he's trying to contain himself in public. At home, he's already planning nursery furniture and talking about teaching a child to ride almost before they can walk." They found Margaret Jensen at the refreshment tent, deep in conversation with the mayor's wife about improvements to the town's new schoolhouse. The older woman's face brightened when she spotted Hannah, excusing herself to greet her daughter-in-law with a warm embrace. "There you are, my dear. Joseph just sent word that their stallion took blue ribbon. He's insufferably proud, of course, but Isaac deserves equal credit for selecting the bloodlines." Margaret's expression softened as she studied Hannah's face. "You're looking wonderful. Motherhood agrees with you already." Hannah touched her abdomen wonderingly. "It doesn't quite seem real yet, though the morning sickness certainly does." "Just wait until the quickening," Margaret advised. "That first flutter of movement, there's nothing like it in the world. Elizabeth wrote to me about it when she was carrying before." She paused, the old grief momentarily visible before her natural resilience reasserted itself. "Well, that's the miracle of family, isn't it? The circle continues, even when we think it's broken." Before Hannah could respond, a familiar pair of strong arms encircled her from behind, and Isaac's voice murmured in her ear, "Congratulating yourself on marrying into a family of champion horse breeders, Mrs. Jensen." Hannah turned in his embrace, noting the healthy color in his tanned face and the relaxed set of his shoulders that had replaced the perpetual tension she'd first observed in Idaho City. "Actually, I was just agreeing to judge pies with your mother and Aunt Harriet. A dangerous assignment in my current state. I may approve of all of them equally." Isaac laughed, the sound still rare enough to draw glances from those nearby who remembered the serious, reserved man who had first accompanied Hannah to Baker City a year earlier. "Then it's fortunate I've come to rescue you. Father wants us both at the main pavilion, something about the governor's representative wanting to meet the family responsible for improving the territory's horse stock so dramatically this year." As they made their way through the fair together, Hannah marveled at how far they had come from that desperate encounter at the well. The journey had not always been smooth. They had weathered arguments about how to balance their independent spirits with their commitment to each other, navigated the complexities of family relationships long damaged by grief, and adjusted to the rhythms of married life after years of solitude for both of them. Yet through it all, They had maintained the essential truth that had drawn them together: respect for each other's strength and recognition of how their separate journeys had prepared them for this shared path. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Isaac asked as they paused at the edge of the crowded pavilion. Hannah smiled up at him, her heart full. "About how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us exactly where we need to be. If my father hadn't died, if I hadn't been forced to flee, if those men hadn't surrounded me at that well, if a certain stubborn cowboy hadn't been passing by at just that moment," Isaac continued, his eyes warm with memory. "Exactly." Hannah reached up to touch his cheek, no longer weathered from constant exposure to the elements now that he divided his time between the trail and home. "Sometimes I wonder if Elizabeth somehow had a hand in bringing us together. A final gift from the sister who wanted you to find joy again." Isaac was quiet for a moment, considering this idea. "I'd like to think so," he said finally. "She always did have a way of arranging things to turn out right, even when they seemed impossible." "Then I'll thank her properly when we visit her grave next spring," Hannah said softly, "and introduce her to her niece or nephew." Isaac's hand came to rest protectively over hers where it lay on her stomach. "A family of our own," he marveled. "Something I never thought I'd have again or deserve. Something we've both earned," Hannah corrected gently. "Not despite our pasts, but because of them. Every choice, every hardship, every moment of courage brought us here." Around them, the fair continued its cheerful bustle, children laughing, music playing, communities coming together to celebrate the harvest and the prosperity that hard work had brought to this once wild territory. It was a fitting backdrop for their own personal harvest, the love and family they had built from the seeds of a chance encounter. As Joseph waved to them from the pavilion steps, Isaac offered Hannah his arm with the quiet confidence of a man who had finally found his place in the world. "Shall we, Mrs. Jensen?" Hannah slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, her smile as bright as the autumn sunshine. "Lead on, Mr. Jensen. We have a future waiting." Together, they stepped forward into the life they had chosen, not perfect, but perfectly theirs, built on the solid foundation of two independent spirits who had discovered that the greatest freedom of all was the courage to love without reservation.